In our last video, we looked at the very interesting life of Kate Claxton that you see pictured here to the right, advertising coming to town and doing a performance. Then, of course, as we go down the street west, you have the fire hall, and then you have this large building here, which was the Sanford block, or the Sanford building. This building had many businesses in it over the years. One of those businesses was Standard Novelty Company. According to this advertisement, it doesn't appear that there's novelties at all here. It looks more like it's a clothing store. You can see here Mechanics Clothing, the Majestic is the brand, and I was surprised to see on here that they sold duck coats and trousers. So maybe this is a novelty store. So I researched it and I came up with this. This gives you a pretty good view of the duck coat and the duck trousers. But upon careful examination of the photo, I see that this duck rode a motorcycle, and I think this would have been the wrong time era. So I researched a little bit further and came up with this. This shows the duck coat that was used by the military, and of course the duck trousers that went with it. So I would expect that the advertisement was for a uniform of some sort, since that was also advertised in the ad. Another business that was located here was the Port Huron Cycle and Electric Company, which was originally established as the Pioneer Cycle Company in 1891. R.E. Moss was a proprietor and George E. Yoakum was the manager. Mr. Yoakum was born in Port Huron in 1863 and was an expert electrician. They had fitted out the tunnel depot, wired the courthouse, and most of the principal residences and business places of the city. And if you remember our other videos, you would see that he would later go on to sell cars on Military Street. And here's a photograph of that, or an advertisement, I probably should say. Another business that was located there was the Ullenbrook Florist Store. I know most of us remember it up near Mueller Brass on Lapeer Avenue, but back then, in the early 1900s, their office was in this building on Water Street, but the greenhouse was located on Lapeer up by Mueller Brass. And before that, they had an office in the 100 block of Huron Avenue, so they've been around a long time, and they're still in existence today. Another company that had their office there was the Excelsior Electric Company, and of course, William Davison, being the secretary and manager of the company, would have his office there as well. Later, this would become the Port Huron Light and Power Company that would be located here. The main occupants of the Sanford building had to do with printing, both private printing and newspaper printing. The private printing was done by the Riverside Printing Company. Lawrence Sherman was the president, and they did bookbinders, and they did, they were dealers in stationery, as you can see with the Sims here. And they were also publishers of the Beehive, which was the Maccabees publication, and also the Michigan Maccabees, and also the Ladies Maccabees, which isn't listed here, along with a couple other ones, such as the Foresters. The newspaper that printed their editions out of this building was the Port Huron Times. And originally, the Port Huron Times was a weekly paper called the Weekly Times, and later on, as they became more successful, they also printed a Daily Times as well. Alright, I know some of you historians are saying to yourself, oh, wait a minute, I thought the Times Herald was originally printed in the Sherman building, which was next door to the building that we're looking at now. The only problem is, during this particular time period, that building hadn't been built yet, and so the Times was operating out of this building. Originally, the Port Huron Times, when it was a weekly newspaper, was actually printed out of the Merchant building, which is, on the northeast corner of Water and Military Street, where later the Michigan National Bank would be, and Bank America as well. During the same time period, this is what appears in the directories for Port Huron. And it gives you the location there, the same one we've just been talking about. But what I thought was interesting from this is that the papers had no secrets about which way they were leaning. For example, the Portier and Commercial was a Democratic paper for the Democrats, and the Portier and Times was a Republican. You can see the REP behind the Times and the DEM underneath the Portier and Commercial. So there's no question which way they were leaning, like there is today, although sometimes it's pretty easy to tell. I don't know if you noticed or not, but the Riverside Printing was owned by Mr. Sherman, as well as the Portier and Times. And you can see here, I told you they would go next door, which was a new building called the Sherman Building at the time, which was at 543 Water Street. And you can see from this directory here of the newspapers that the LOTM Review was at 543 Water. The Michigan Maccabees was at that address, and of course the Portier Daily and Weekly Times was out of that address. And then toward the bottom, the Thresherman's Review was also part of the address. So Mr. Sherman was very involved in the printing business. And as a side note, his family is where the name Sherman Woods came from, the north end of town. The Sherman Building, of course, was owned by Lawrence Sherman, and he moved his whole operation over from the building next to it to the new building. And in this advertisement here, you can see the Sherman Building featured in the center. And then around it, which we'll look at in a second, we'll see the different facets of the business, especially for the Riverside Printing Company. Here we see the composition room with the workers posing for the camera. And down here, we come to the bindery department, which I assume is where they bound things together. And as we pan over here to the right, we come to the stereotyping department. Stereotyping was a process in which a whole page of type was cast in a single mold, so that a printing plate could be made from it. Until the invention of the stereotype printing, type had to be reset if a second printing was to be made. The invention of the stereotype led to the mass producing of printing plates. This enabled multiple copies to be sent to other printers and newspapers, enabling larger numbers of identical images to be reproduced. I think it's interesting that the word stereotype and also the word cliché come from printers' words. Stereotype became a metaphor for any set of ideas repeated identically or with only minor changes. Cliché was actually the word for the sound that was made during the stereotyping process, when the matrix, or that's the papier-mâché mold, bearing an impression of the form, hit the molten metal. So there was a distinct sound, and that was called a cliché, and you would get it over and over and over. And so both of those words that we use today came from the printer's words. Well, last but not least, we come to the press room, and this is where the finished product comes to being. And it was shipped out there to the merchants and residents of the city. As you can see, the Riverside Printing Company was quite an operation. That, along with printing the newspaper from that same building, I imagine it was pretty noisy in that building. As we zoom back in on this building, you can see there's not much on the outside of the building to let you know that Riverside Printing is even there. But when we look at this building in this picture here, you can see it's quite well advertised on the outside of the building. And as we scroll down here, you can kind of get an idea of the time period because you have the horse and the wagon out front. As we zoom in closer here, we can see two men at the top sliding bags down this chute, and we see a couple men, maybe three men at the bottom catching them, so they were loading those onto the wagon, I would assume. On a side note, businesses in Fort Huron were quite proud of the fact that some of their employees were involved in the Spanish-American War. Here we see a photograph of several employees of the Riverside Printing Company. It was published in the 1899 City Directory, and this is what it says about it. When the gallant soldier boys of our city shouldered their guns on the 26th day of April, 1898, and gladly and willingly faced all kinds of dangers for their country's sake, there were 6 employees of the Riverside Printing Company among their number. As these gentlemen published the first English paper ever published in Cuba, we take pleasure in saying that to their undivided efforts, this directory is typographically composed. We therefore present them in the accompanying cut as they appeared in the Santiago de Cuba while working on the Company F Enterprise. I assume this was a paper for the company the soldiers could read at their convenience. Now you notice that there's 9 fellows here in the picture, but they only reference the 6 employees, so whether it's 6 that are standing, we don't know, but it does give the names down below the caption of the photograph. In this photograph here, you can see the 2 larger buildings. That's the Sanford building on the right and the Sherman building on the left, and then there's a small building in between, and that had various businesses in it over the years. And you can see from this photograph here that at one time it was the Wonder Bar. This photograph looked like it was taken just before they tore that block down. And you can see the signage in this photograph as well. If you go back into the 1800s, you can see the Sanford building here, but of course the Sherman building hadn't been built yet. But you can see these little stores that preceded that building. And as we zoom in here, you can see right next to the larger building, it was James Bulligan. He was a tinsmith. And you can see the signage there if you look carefully. The W. Granger signage right next door was actually a tailor. And then right next to that was Ortenberger's. And you can't really read that, but it was Ernest Ortenberger, who was at that time a shoemaker. This was the same Ortenberger family that would go into harness making and leather goods, and eventually would park a white horse out in front of their establishment on Military Street. Alright, in our next video we'll continue down the block on Water Street into the 600 block and see what there is to see there.